Good morning. My name is Sarah Khan. I am the moderator for this panel. I welcome you all. I'm a community fellow at the Dudley Institute for Global Health, one of the co-sponsors of this event. The panel discussion is on the global future of civilian protection, learning from the Gaza genocide, co-hosted by the Dudley Institute for Global Health Research and the Refugee Studies Center at York University. Before we begin, I will read the York University land acknowledgement and then proceed with a few housekeeping issues. Land acknowledgement. First Nations have lived on this part of Turtle Island for millennia, stewarding the land, the water, and all that contributes to life in this region. Today, the culture, presence of First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples enrich the lands and people of this territory. More than 2 centuries ago, the Mississauga people welcomed settlers to their territory, providing sustenance and engaging in trade and commerce. Today, York University campuses are located on the Toronto Purchase Treaty No. 13 lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations and the lands of the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaties First Nations. Our campuses are also situated on the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. Treaty history is foundational, and it is our collective responsibility to honor the land as we honor and respect those who have gone before us, those who are here and those who have yet to come. We are grateful for the opportunity to be learning, working, thriving on this land. We commit to learn the truth and be active in the process of reconciliation. And that is the York University land acknowledgement. Now, a few housekeeping issues before I open this discussion. The format for the discussion is a tour de table. Each panelist will speak for 12 minutes approximately, and then we'll have a round of responses from the panelists at the end for 5 minutes, either adding to their discussion or responding to another panelist's presentation. Thereafter, we will open up the floor for questions. There is a Q&A box, which will open up around the question time. You can ask your questions and I will select the questions from the panelists from there. We will endeavor to answer as many. All the questions coming in are anonymous. A link to read the detailed bios of the panelists is provided in the Zoom chat for your perusal. As we are tight on time, the panelists nor myself will be going into many details about their bio. I now extend a very warm welcome to the panelists and will briefly introduce them in order of speaking. You could raise your hand, that might help. Dr. Heidi Matthews is Assistant Professor at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. Jane Kenny-Munt, Chief Executive Officer at the United Nations Association, UK. Thanks for joining us from London. Amra Lee, PhD candidate on protection and civilians at Australian National University. Thanks for joining us, Amra. Canberra, it is very late. Dalia Alfara, whose family is from Gaza, is an educator, writer, and community organizer. And Dr. Yiping Gi represents Doctors Against Genocide Network. Thank you to all the panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to provide us your insights at this moment, especially with the conflict in the backdrop of the US-Israel attack on Iran, the attack on Lebanon, the spillover with Iran's retaliation in the region. A ceasefire is coming into effect for Iran, maybe, and it's unclear what the situation with Lebanon is. Any ceasefire is welcome in terms of protecting civilians, as we all know. This conflict has had global economic and political impact, which is still unraveling. It's still not clear what the entire significance of this conflict is going to be, but it's certainly already impacting a lot of aspects of people's lives, beyond petroleum prices, which seems to be the focus very often. What we are really focusing on here with the panelists, and we hope to learn from all of you, based on your scholarship, practice, and lived experience in Gaza and the region, is how the Gaza playbook has been shaped and the practices that have enabled it vis-a-vis civilian protection. Have practices also emerged that can help preserve the space for protecting civilians? The panel was specifically requested to speak to the following questions, and I'm going to read them out. What have been the protection of civilians' lessons from the conflict in Gaza? What impact do the developments in Gaza have for protecting civilians in other conflicts today and tomorrow? In these difficult times, where are the opportunities for hope? Because hope is what we all have. And where should those who are committed to protecting civilians invest their efforts? The first three speakers, Heidi, Amra, and Jane, will lay the broad trend lines out for us that are potentially undermining the global structures traditionally responding to protecting civilians from harm and diminishing the responsibility of duty bearers vis-a-vis right holders. Then we will have Dahlia and Yiping provide us some glimmers of hope, I think, with the developments centering not on institutions, but on people and their agency, their engagement in upholding protection of civilians, elaborating whether this is unique to Gaza or it is something that can be replicated for other conflicts. I want to remind the panelists and audiences as well that the UN Charter begins with "we the people" rather than "we the member states" or anything else. Now I'll ask Heidi to begin her presentation on international humanitarian law after Gaza. Over to you, Heidi.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah, for organizing, to the Donnelly Institute for sponsoring, and of course, as well to the Center for Refugee Studies for co-sponsorship. It's important and heartening to see cross-university organized research unit sponsorship of an event as important as I think this one is. So thanks very much for that. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a small number of slides. And I may be speaking a little bit more quickly than I would ordinarily to try and get through in the short time that I have. Okay, so this talk is about the future of IHL after Gaza. We've been asked to speak specifically about this idea of the Gaza playbook, which I started sort of thinking more intensely about in preparation for the talk. It seems that this is a new phrase we have. It's entered the lexicon to describe, I think, the uniquely destructive nature of Israel's military operations in the Strip since October 2023, but also how this level of civilian harm is being intentionally normalized for replication in other so-called theaters of conflict. And so the language of a playbook and of a theater both invoke conceptual spaces where new strategy is tested through acts of performance and even gaming. We see that with White House videos being released where bombing Iran today is depicted as a Wii video game, for example. And we also see that through social media, including yesterday's really incredible threat from President Trump that, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight. And I've actually reframed my comments today in light of what very nearly, I think, became a watershed moment, perhaps a seriously threatened breach of the nuclear taboo even. So this is a very dangerous moment that we're in, and I wanted to foreground that and tie it directly back to this idea of the Gaza playbook. So this is what I would say are some elements of the Gaza playbook. I won't be able to talk about each. I'm going to focus on the fifth. There are probably others that I have not included, but these came immediately to mind. So deliberately undermining the framework that regulates legally resorting to the use of force in the first place, normalizing indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, patterns of attacks that are specifically directed against categories of civilian objects, including schools and healthcare, the weaponization of humanitarian aid, and then what I'm going to focus on more directly in the short time I have today is a systematic and open use of genocidal discourse as acceptable in terms of a negotiation strategy or as a tactic for instilling fear in civilian populations. So as I mentioned already, this event takes place really on the morning after a day-long global crisis yesterday, generated by Trump's Truth Social post, where he openly threatened genocidal violence against Iran in what now looks like an effort to compel Iran to accede to various American demands, most notably the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Folks who are following will know that Trump gave Iran until 8 p.m. Eastern to, quote, make a deal, writing, as you will see, that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. I don't want that to happen, but it probably will. We'll find out tonight. And of course, now we have this notion of a ceasefire, which is likely fragile. Many commentators credibly feared that the gulf between the two states was so wide that escalation was all but inevitable. Thankfully, we didn't reach that point, but folks remain extremely concerned. Others downplayed the severity of the threat, and I think that's a mistake. And so some of those commentators suggested, for example, that Trump was actually confusing the idea of civilization with civilian infrastructure. And others noted that really, at the end of the day, the two sides are no closer to achieving their goals in any sort of long-term sense than they were weeks ago, and that essentially we're back to perhaps square one in this conflict. So with respect to the Gaza playbook, I want to make a couple of core observations. The first is that this debacle shows us that discourse matters for the protection of civilians. This is especially true in the context of situations that are genocidal or are at serious risk of becoming genocidal. Genocide studies and international criminal law scholars like myself have long studied the role of official political discourse in generating conditions that are conducive to the practice of genocide. We've seen this across myriad genocides long before the Nazi regime began systematically murdering Jews. Its propaganda manufactured consent for the Holocaust using dehumanizing language, likening Jews to animals, vermin, or insects. Similar discursive practices were prevalent in the lead up to the genocide in Rwanda, where radio was used to disseminate dehumanizing messages about Tutsis, referring to them as, quote, cockroaches. Expert witnesses at the subsequent genocide trials noted that in Rwanda, the effect of language was lethal, and hate media played a key role in the instigation of the genocide. We've seen similar patterns in the Canadian context, revealed in particular by the recent national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. I have 2 children homesick with me today, so my apologies if that's being disruptive. In the context of its genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, South Africa, importantly, recently released a public dossier of openly available evidence relating to Israel's acts and evidence of genocide. This enormous document meticulously details evidence of genocidal intent on the part of Israeli leaders, including statements using dehumanizing and annihilatory rhetoric. There are many examples, of course, that we could give, but just one is speaking before the Knesset in October, Prime Minister Netanyahu describing Israel's position with respect to Gaza as, quote, a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. Yoav Gallant, who is then Minister of Defense, similarly stated that, quote, we're fighting with human animals. And just as a reminder to folks that Netanyahu and Gallant are both currently under indictment at the International Criminal Court for several war crimes and crimes against humanity. At this juncture, I want to quickly note an important critique in the field made by scholars like A. Dirk Moses, most notably and recently, which worries that focusing on the crime of genocide using this language might carry unintended consequences, particularly around backgrounding or perhaps even normalizing civilian harm that is considered less spectacular and therefore perhaps of lower importance in what is really a non-existent hierarchy of crimes against civilians. Uh, Moses notes, for example, that genocide is a category mistake in the legal regime ostensibly protecting civilians, while scholars and humanitarians want to prevent their destruction. The preoccupation with genocide as the quote crime of crimes diminishes the significance of other types of civilian death caused by bombing cities, drone strikes, blockades, and sanctions. And so while I would generally agree with this critique about the fetishization of genocide, I also want to make three caveats that are particularly relevant in the context of the Gaza playbook and its ramifications, in particular for the war in Iran and Lebanon and the wider region today. The first turns us back to South Africa's case at the ICJ and asks us to look at the theory of the case specifically. So South Africa argues that the pattern of international humanitarian law, or IHL, violations is actually so severe that it has resulted in Palestinians in Gaza being denied civilian protection as a group. And that this pattern of conduct, in addition to official genocidal statements, is, quote, consistent with the total dehumanization of a people, implicit and necessary for the commission of genocide. Relatedly, South Africa argues that the manner in which these systematic IHL violations have occurred itself constitutes an instrumentalization of international humanitarian law to genocidal ends. Israeli and American weaponization of humanitarian assistance in the Strip is one key example of this process among many others. And so in other words, when understood as part of a system of standalone IHL violations, genocide analysis can productively function alongside identification and condemnation of war crimes and crimes against humanity for both legal and political purposes. The second caveat to the critique points out that there's something I think qualitatively different about Trump's extreme intensification of rhetoric that itself functions to normalize widespread and systematic IHL violations. Overtly genocidal threats pale in comparison suddenly to Trump's equally unlawful threats to inflict unprecedented destruction on Iran's vital civilian infrastructure, including bridges, power plants, oil installations, and desalination facilities. So in addition to resulting in massive civilian death, that kind of destruction would effectively cripple civilian life in Iran, amounting to collective punishment. And this would invoke a range of war crimes, principally because the goal of these attacks would not be to destroy military objectives, but rather to indiscriminately and disproportionately target the civilian population. So after Trump's rhetorical ploy yesterday, we suddenly find ourselves in a situation where directly and intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure somehow remains on the table as a possible response should negotiations and the fragile ceasefire fail over the next 2 weeks.
2-minute warning, Heidi.
Thank you. The third and last caveat to the critique is about the importance of third state responses or lack thereof. So we've seen Trump's rhetoric surpasses dehumanizing metaphors in Gaza and elsewhere. While Israeli leaders' prior rhetoric about civilizational destruction was often camouflaged, for example, couching it within biblical stories around the destruction of the Amalek people, this discourse paved the way for Trump's open threats of civilizational destruction against the Iranian people. And a key factor in this process has been the near total lack of adequate response, first with respect to Gaza and now Iran. We see this in the Canadian context, as I say this, speaking as somebody situated in Gaza. All right, thank you.
Sorry, Heidi, we're being very strict on this, but I think thank you very much for pointing out that protection of civilians is a broad area of crimes, and that should not be lost in focus. I think what you describe is also relevant not just for the region, but for places like Myanmar and Sudan especially, where again a specter of another genocide is unfolding. If all the speakers could keep their videos off, we'll only have the person who's speaking with their video on. Thank you again, Heidi, and over to you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me today. It's good to see you all here. I'm speaking from London, where I lead the United Nations Association of the UK. And just to introduce that, we are an 80-year-old charity that brings together people from all around the UK, teaming up with people internationally to support the principles of the United Nations. That's part of a global movement because around the world there are more than 100 United Nations associations, including one in Canada, for example, who work in different ways to build public support for the principles of the UN. I don't speak for any of them, I speak only for my organisation, but I want to make it clear, firstly, that I'm going to talk about the UN, but not on behalf of the UN. And secondly, that really, as Sarah alluded to by talking about we the peoples, this is a time where people's support for the principles of peace and international law are absolutely essential if those principles are going to survive. I believe that now is a time where there is widespread revulsion around the world at the current direction of travel and the failure to protect civilians, whether in Gaza or Sudan or before that in Syria. There is an opportunity for collective power if people around the world do find ways to speak up and to put pressure on their own governments and on the governments that are committing atrocities. But if people do not do that, what we can see from what has happened in Gaza is that governments will not implement international law of their own accord. They will not stand up for it when it is politically inconvenient. They really do need to be pushed to do that. So really working within our societies, creating that political movement, and standing up against dehumanization. I think all of that is really important. So basically, that is summing up what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say a bit more about the current situation, what's happening, and what the UN has and hasn't been able to do. The UN being a place that is founded on certain principles, but is also a kind of battleground in a non-literal way for states who aren't necessarily upholding those principles, of course. As with Heidi's presentation, I think we do need to ground today's discussion in this context of now and the last 24 hours with the US president reaching this level of threatening to wipe out a civilization. I spent the last few years immersed in the world of nuclear risk analysis and talking to many experts on nuclear deterrent and disarmament. There were genuine worries yesterday that when Trump talked about wiping out civilization, he was implicitly referring to the possible use of nuclear weapons, which would be the third time and the only time since 1945 that nuclear weapons were detonated in a war. Now, of course, that has not happened. Those fears turned out to be incorrect, thank goodness. But it's the fact that people were even worrying about that shows us the kind of level to which we have come. We've seen, on the positive side, that there has been that backlash. There have been multiple members of Congress, mostly Democrats, of course, calling for the president to be declared unfit for office. And we've also had many people sending out messages trying to remind military personnel that they are still liable if they carry out orders that are unlawful. So people have been messaging that in an attempt to forestall possible worse war crimes than those we've already had. And late yesterday, of course, we had the news of a temporary ceasefire, at least, and the worst fears have not come to bear. But we are living in a world where a whole new generation is growing up with this being the political tone that is set from the very top, with the possibility of wiping out a civilization being used as a negotiating tactic. That in itself is scary. And also, while we have this temporary ceasefire in place, it is shaky. Attacks are continuing as we speak. Israel continues to attack Lebanon. Iran is continuing to attack the UAE. And there have already been 38 days of war crimes by all sides, starting with the illegal nature of the US and Israeli attack on Iran in the first place, and then with these deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure from all sides. So everyone has been violating international law. And it does seem that the events of the last several years have led a growing number of countries to draw the conclusion that international law is a constraint that weakens countries. I think we need also to bear in mind the context of Russia's invasion and occupation of Ukraine, which has now passed the 4-year mark, and which has indicated that a nuclear armed power that is represented on the UN Security Council has been able to invade its neighbour and no one has been able to stop it. At the same time, Russia has not been able to achieve its full objectives. It hasn't got the regime change that it wanted to achieve in Ukraine. It's had a lot of losses itself. But it is part of this issue where, in some cases, extreme might has made some kind of strategic gains for key players. And this behavior by Russia has also encouraged conversations within Western countries from people saying, well, maybe in this context, our international legal obligations are shackles. Maybe these are kind of handcuffs that prevent us from competing in a world with Russia and China. Now, that's a very simplistic argument. There's obviously many cases in the past where Western countries have violated international law, especially in the Middle East. It can't be framed entirely as a response to Russia. It also raises the question of, what are Western countries trying to claim about themselves if they don't see any value in holding any moral high ground on international law. But nonetheless, this debate is there and it's very real and it's happening, in discussions about nuclear weapons. It's happening in discussions about whether to put guardrails around the integration of artificial intelligence into weapons systems. And really, it's happening across all levels. So that's one of the bad conclusions that is being drawn. And then I think that another conclusion that is being drawn from the levels of civilian harm we've seen in recent years, and particularly from what's happened in Gaza, is that in this world of political polarization and disinformation, you can use emotions and fear to get your supporters to believe your justifications. And what we've been seeing, with Gaza, and now with Lebanon, is that, in the early days of Israel's assault on Gaza after October 7th, when there were incidents where many civilians were killed or when medical facilities and personnel were targeted, there would be a very extensive conversation about what had happened and a very extensive justification put forward. Many of those claims were bogus. There was a big propaganda war. But now there are attacks happening on Lebanese healthcare by Israel on a virtually daily basis, including this morning. And most of the time, the justification is not even being made. But supporters will say, well, of course, there must have been a terrorist lurking in that ambulance. They're sort of making the arguments for themselves without even needing the propaganda work to be done. And this too is rooted in a very broad and extensive campaign of dehumanization on the internet and on social media, where we're seeing a kind of discourse that, I've never seen until recent years in my lifetime, but now is a world that my kids are going to be exposed to as they get bigger and as they get onto social media accounts, that you will see people using kind of unbelievably dehumanizing comments about each other's dead relatives and about who deserves what. Comments that people in peaceful countries would never make to each other in person, but which are becoming a daily occurrence online. And I think we can't really overestimate the kind of degrading effect that this is having on people's psychology as this kind of discourse starts to be normalized. So this is the kind of bad conclusions that are being drawn from the abuses that have happened and also from the impunity that there has been. But of course, other conclusions can and should also be drawn. I think we do see with the sort of massive revulsion that there has been against the threats against Iran and also the huge popular movement around the world in support of the Palestinians of Gaza, we can see that naturally people do not want to see these levels of abuse of other human beings, but very often they don't know how they should respond. And we're also seeing, I think, growing attention and to an influence of faith leaders. I think the Pope, the current Pope, and the previous Pope are quite notable here because there is a real hunger for people who have a moral voice. And I was struck with the Pope's recent comments on Iran, where he was saying we should all pray for peace, but we shouldn't only pray for peace. We should also be standing up and telling our representatives and telling people around us that we need peace, which I thought was quite interesting. I think we've also seen that, as has been shown by Gaza and by Ukraine, civilians need to be protected not only from the direct threats of the bombs and bullets, but from the attacks on essential infrastructure, the infrastructure that provides the foundations of life, such as, food, hospitals, water facilities,
One
the
minute
kind of
warning, Jane.
attacks. Thank you. The kind of attacks that we've seen so much in Sudan and Yemen and Syria, as well as in Gaza. And finally, and I'll be happy to talk about this more in the discussion, we've seen that the UN is really a space for contestation where it comes under very, very heavy pressure to not speak out. The UN International Court of Justice and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory in Israel, they have borne witness in important ways and they have stood up against the commission of genocidal acts. There has been important humanitarian relief through some agencies, but action through the Security Council has been blocked. This has accelerated debates on how to give a greater role to the General Assembly, but that is something that is really stuck. And we've seen the UNRWA, the key UN agency providing services for Palestinian refugees, has been heavily defunded and its ability to operate in Gaza heavily crushed, its property in East Jerusalem confiscated and demolished to a degree that at one time would have seemed unthinkable. We've seen the empowerment of the Board of Peace as a so-called alternative to the UN, at least when it comes to Gaza. So there's a lot of contestation going inside the UN, and there's going to be real limits to what the UN can do unless people are pushing the member states to actually live up to the principles that they've all signed up to. I'll stop there. Look forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jane, for keeping in time. I think we are nicely moving into Amara's segment because you do mention the role of UNRWA and what's happening with UNRWA, and Amara is going to be focusing on humanitarian assistance. Before Jane goes, I think it'll be very interesting for those listening to really ask her the questions about where is the UN positioning itself. This is not the first time the UN Security Council has frozen and there's been pressure on the General Assembly. But perhaps this is the first time, as Jane rightly notes, there's an enormous contestation of the UN's role as a norm manufacturer and as an independent, neutral voice working with all the member states. And every time the UN's criticized, I have said this previously as well, that it's not the UN on its own, it's the member states. So I think it's a very important point that Jane brings up. How are the member states engaging with the UN? Hopefully you will add more on how the UN can improve itself in the 5 minutes you have when we do a tour at the end of everyone's presentations. Okay, with that, over to Amara.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to everyone involved in bringing this important discussion together. So first of all, I should acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I am presenting from today, and I pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm a PhD researcher at the Australian National University, but I'm also a senior practitioner with a lot of experience in humanitarian response. In 2023, I was with the UN mission in New York as a senior humanitarian advisor, and I've also worked in West Asia region. So my presentation will focus on the three questions put to the panel, but I will shift the lens towards the humanitarian issues, and in particular, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So there will be a little bit of overlap across the different presentations, even though we've sort of tried to carve out a neat little spot. I think there is a lot of intersection between international law, genocide, humanitarian assistance, and also international peace and security. So starting with lessons from Gaza, I think there are too many. We've already heard about performative adherence to IHL through the use of evacuation orders to forcibly displace civilians, and then systematic attacks on civilian infrastructure. But here I'm going to focus on the removal of the UN-led aid delivery and its replacement with the Israeli-US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which MSF later referred to as a mechanism for orchestrated killing, and the UN also referred to as aid death traps. So this started with the dehumanizing rhetoric, which previous presenters mentioned, in particular the declaration of a complete siege on Gaza following the 7th of October attack, and the use of language that they would be fighting human animals and would act accordingly. So soon after, we also start to see systematic political and physical attacks on the UN, including UNRWA in particular. And we also saw record aid worker death tolls, which were driven principally by the war on Gaza and on UNRWA staff in particular. We also started to see this intense contestation of all UN and NGO data, which I haven't observed previously in any other crisis that I've worked. I mean, it is contested, but not to this extent. And so within all of this, within the course of a siege and starvation, which is also part of a wider pattern of decreasing respect for international law that can seem before Gaza, but has been very extreme in Gaza. So as early as December, we saw a first warning issued of famine from the IPC, which is the Integrated Phase Classification System, which makes declarations of famine and also issues warnings to act. We saw a second warning in March 24, and then we saw a worst case scenario famine unfolding in July 2025. And so between March 2024, or actually even earlier, and July 2025, we saw the UN-led system removed from the Gaza Strip and replaced with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation during an imminent risk of famine that then deteriorated into a worst case scenario famine. And as famine expert Alex de Waal stated, this is the most minutely, precisely engineered starvation that he has seen, and also unprecedented, with the necessary level of aid just sitting 1 hour away at the border. And just one other sort of trend to note in terms of this disinformation is that I feel, or you could see actually, that people's lack of understanding of famine was exploited. Many people think famine is a natural phenomenon, and you know, historically there may have been some instances, but the vast majority of contemporary famines are the deliberate starvation and a strategy of war. So instead of this necessary aid being permitted to go into the Gaza Strip to avert the famine, what we saw was performative airdrops, of which several countries were involved. We saw a comment from a Canadian diplomat saying that we know this is insufficient, but this is all we're sort of being permitted to do. And we know that airdrops were dangerous, undignified, can't deliver aid at the scale that was needed, and also placed civilians at greater risk in terms of the actual risk of the airdrop killing and injuring people, but also in terms of unable to support vulnerable groups to access the aid they needed to survive. So just a brief timeline to recap some of what I've said previously. We saw the Israeli Knesset pass laws banning UNRWA in 2024. We saw in 2025 the GHF, or the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, emerged in mysterious circumstances. The funding was opaque. The people involved, there were rumors, but it was very hard to verify. And so, as I mentioned earlier, so during this critical risk of famine, we saw the GHF take over from the UN. The UN had previously 400 distribution sites that the GHF reduced to 4 that were concentrated in the south, which required Palestinians trying to survive a man-made famine to walk long distances or to relocate and to cross through dangerous militarized zones simply to access food. So by August 2025, we had nearly 1,400 Palestinians killed at these sites, or at or near these sites. And it was only after the announcement of a Gaza ceasefire that, which we know has not been the ceasefire that was it should have been, that the GHF was dismantled. But coming back to my title around this sort of remaking of order, if you look at the outgoing statement from the executive director, John Ackery, who was a former USAID official, he talks about many positive aspects of the model being used or considered to improve aid distribution in Gaza and other parts of the world. So I see the GHF pilot as a bigger remaking of world order plans. So what we saw is the UN-led aid delivery system removed from Gaza during an imminent risk of famine and replaced with a mechanism that led to a worst case famine unfolding, but also further crimes which are being investigated. And we have several of the same US and Israeli individuals involved in both the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and Board of Peace. So coming to the second question, in terms of the implications of impunity for Gaza, that this was allowed to happen at all is incredibly disturbing. The UN Commission of Inquiry in September last year concluded that genocide is occurring in Gaza, building on a growing body of evidence from genocide experts and scholars. And they explicitly linked the GHF and control over aid to the intention of Israeli authorities to continuously impose starvation and unlivable conditions of life. So taking a step out of Gaza and sort of thinking a bit more about this Gaza playbook, which we can see expanding and increasing threats across the region. This has been an incredible, dangerous weakening of laws, norms, and institutions designed to protect civilians and preserve humanity in war. There were many warnings issued by experts about Gaza, trying to mobilize people to act to prevent genocide, to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. And in doing so, experts often said, well, if you don't care about what happens here, you need to understand what this means for other crises, what it means for people in Sudan, al-Fasher Sudan, or in Lebanon right now, or in Iran. Basically what is allowed to happen here sets a standard in this shift to a might makes right world where people, where there's decreasing respect for the resort to force and the use of force. And this has incredibly concerning implications for civilians, but also wider international peace and security. So Heidi talked a little bit about third states. One thing I will mention or talk about in terms of maybe a lesson is I've been on lots of forums with different experts, academic, legal practitioners, and one thing that came out in these discussions was a gap around more real-time pressure and accountability. I think we have seen international justice step up for Gaza, and that we've had the ICJ issue, a warning around plausible risk very early on. We've had multiple provisional measures issued, including calling on third states to recognize their responsibilities. But we still haven't been able to sufficiently stop the problematic conduct. And I know that is obviously an ambitious aim, but we do need to think about how we can exert more real-time pressure and accountability. So in terms of opportunity for hope, I find it a bit difficult right now. I know that we have a ceasefire in Iran, but I think over maybe an hour or so ago, we've had over 100 strikes on Lebanon, and Beirut, South Beirut, and the Bekaa and the South. But I do think hope is important. For me in my research on protecting civilians in a changing world order, one of the interesting findings that's come out, and I think will resonate with a lot of people, is the importance of a little bit of courage. So when the laws and norms and institutions that protect civilians are attacked, it's a little bit of courage to step up and to name things clearly, to call out the conduct clearly, to avoid silencing tactics and other strategies to stop naming the problematic conduct and who's driving it and how we should respond to it.
2-minute warning, Amra.
Thanks. And then just finally, I did find some hope in this statement from UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, issued this month, where she said, you know, this is the first genocide that's created a popular movement against it. And I think in terms of, yes, it's been terrible conduct, but we have seen an incredible number of people mobilize across states to resist and to state they don't support this. And even in Australia, initial political rhetoric was, oh, Australians don't care what happens in the Middle East, but polling shows they clearly do, and they don't support what's happening, and they do care. So with that, I will finish. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amra, for keeping time. And I think your last quote actually segues very nicely into Dalia's presentation. But just a comment on your presentation, Amra, I think what you're really laying out is humanitarian agencies in the last 2 decades have probably been the most effective in crises in comparison to, say, the political side of the UN or other institutions or even member states. So to see that kind of dismantling with the expertise built up is frightening because, as you say, it's potentially going to get replicated in other crises, not just by the big powers, but everyone watching. They'll be testing this out as well. So we should really be worried. This is definitely throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. All right, thank you very much. And I'm very excited to have Dalia speak because Dalia is probably, and I keep saying this to Dalia, no pressure, but Dalia's probably speaking on something that is emerging around protection of civilians. Protection of civilians, I dare say, unlike children in armed conflict or women, peace and security, has not had a robust civil society engagement or groundswell in a lot of countries. What Dalia is highlighting is a discussion around a civilian harm, which seems to have caught popular imagination. And protection of civilians grew out of institutions. It was adopted by the UN Security Council in the 1990s. So it has been an institution-led doctrine and rhetoric, so to speak, although there is, of course, discussion among affected communities. But what Dalia is probably going to look at is how it's gone even beyond affected communities and engaged with people who would not necessarily be that interested in issues outside their own environment. So thank you very much, Dalia, again, for agreeing to speak, and over to you.
Thank you, Sara. I want to start today by situating myself in today's conversation. Thank you to my co-panelists. I feel very privileged to be here with you. I'm a Palestinian from Gaza, specifically from the city of Khan Yunis. And today I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation on Turtle Island. My diasporic experience is shaped by displacements, by ongoing violence, and by the constant negotiation of how that reality is named or denied in public spaces. So when I speak about the protection of civilians, I'm not speaking from a distance. For me, the political is personal, and the personal is political. I'm speaking from within a reality where protection has never been guaranteed and where its absence has actually been rationalized. Since the fall of 2023, what we've witnessed is not only the failure to protect civilians, it's a failure to even pretend that protection is the goal. The legal frameworks are still there. International humanitarian law has not disappeared. But what has disappeared is a political will to apply it consistently and without exception. And that matters because what this phase of the genocide in Gaza has revealed is not simply a breakdown, it's a hierarchy of whose lives are protected and whose are rendered killable in plain sight. And now we're seeing this extend beyond Gaza. As Amra just mentioned, literally Beirut is being carpet bombed today after the ceasefire announced between the US and Iran. And Iran and Lebanon, we're seeing again threats and attacks directed at civilian infrastructures like bridges, power systems, essential services, and residential areas. Civilians bear the consequences by death, displacement, destruction of daily life, and widespread fear. Heidi referred to the Gaza playbook, where the boundaries of civilian protection are stretched and reinterpreted and disregarded. And what's happening now in Iran and Lebanon is not, it is following a similar logic. It's not contained, it's actually being reproduced. And yet, alongside this collapse, something else has emerged, not from institutions, but from people. Because the protection of civilians has traditionally, as Sarah and Amr just said, the protection of civilians has traditionally been imagined as something delivered by states, by international bodies, by legal institutions. But what we're seeing now is a shift. Not only have these systems and structures dismantle organizations that protect and sustain, as again, Amra explained with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, they've also failed to deliver the protections and they've become complicit in the harm themselves. So what's happening now is the protection is not being delivered by these institutions. It's actually becoming something that's demanded by the global civil society. And what we've seen over the past few years is an unprecedented scale of witnessing and solidarity. We've seen mass protests, student encampments, labor actions, cultural, institutional pressure, divestment calls, all of that. And they haven't been singular episodes, they've been sustained and ongoing. But it's really important to distinguish what is driving this. Some of the solidarity is political and longstanding, rooted in decades of organizing and analysis. But what we are seeing now is something very different. It's a broader mobilization that's driven by the visibility of harm to civilians. That visibility is really accessible at our fingertips through social media, through the power that social media has gained and the traction. So what happens is people who have not, who may not have previously been engaged politically, are now entering the conversation because of what they're seeing: mass civilian deaths, starvation, denial of care, basic human rights being eradicated. And that distinction matters because it changes who is mobilizing, why they're mobilizing, and how they're mobilizing. What we see this, for example, in the arms embargo campaign, Arms Embargo Now campaign here on Turtle Island. What happened is grassroots groups and advocacy groups came together across the country, across the land, to end arms sales to Israel, lobbying their MPs and trying to get the laws changed, not just ending arms exports or new exports to Israel, but also working on that loophole where Canada actually, doesn't export to Israel anymore, but they export parts to the US and then the US exports that to Israel. So this example is not symbolic. This is reframing the protection at the source. What these people are saying is that if you're serious about protecting civilians, you don't begin after the fact with aid, with charity. You begin by refusing to enable the violence, cut it out at the source. This is protection as prevention. We've seen it in Palestine solidarity networks locally and globally, how everyone has come together to build connections across movements. People from different social justice movements coming together, realizing this is not an isolated issue. It's part of a global, broader global colonial and capitalist structure. We also see this entering institutional and cultural spaces. For example, the arts spaces. I'll give an example like the Toronto Arts Council recently came under a lot of pressure to cut ties with the Israeli Foundation because of their ties to the genocidal state of Israel. And that is an example of spaces that have historically claimed neutrality now being pushed to confront questions of complicity, because right now being neutral or balanced is actually being complicit. And that shift is significant because it really expands where protection is being contested. So what does it mean when we refuse silence as civilians, as civil society? It's not symbolic work, it's really political work. First, it's a form of witnessing. So what we are seeing in the media, in the social media especially, and all the coverage is not are not abstract violations. They're direct accounts of civilian harm, children killed, hospitals leveled, tents sheltering civilians being burned, access to food and medicine denied. As Jane mentioned, this is all being justified and normalized. And this is emerging in situations where journalists and observers are not only restricted, but also killed. So what happens is civilians themselves, doctors, families, individuals, have become the ones documenting. And I believe Dr. Guy will speak to this in a bit. And this creates a form of witnessing that is decentralized, contested, and a lot more authentic and impossible to suppress. And for us, the civil society in the center of empire, it is our job to amplify that and to bear witness to it as well. Because this visibility disrupts something that's very fundamental. Because violence depends on fragmentation, when people refuse silence, they interrupt that. And second, refusing silence carries risk. We've seen people doxxed, losing jobs, facing backlash, and be publicly targeted. So solidarity in this moment is not abstract. It has a very clear cost. Thirdly, refusing silence is about narrative. Because before you can protect civilians, you have to recognize them as humans. You have to insist on their humanity. And what we're seeing, again, across these different contexts is how uneven that recognition remains, how Palestinians, Iranians, Lebanese have to audition their humanity to get protection. So resisting erasure and challenging narrative is not secondary to protection, it's actually central to it. And it's very important not to romanticize this because solidarity has limits. When visibility is given, that doesn't automatically stop violence. Movements face fatigue and repression. And when we have to ask difficult questions, why does some suffering mobilize global response while other crises do not? What makes our solidarity sustainable? But even with all these limits, something definitely has shifted over the past few years. We're seeing a redistribution of what protection means and who is responsible for it. First, away from institutional monopoly, where civil society is now asserting itself as a central actor. Second, from neutrality to accountability. And I do want to acknowledge that language of balance that we keep hearing in both sides, because in many spaces, especially academic spaces, balance is treated as a prerequisite for legitimacy. But in contexts where harm is clearly visible and extensively documented, calls for balance can flatten those asymmetries and obscure the power dynamics at play. So
2-minute
the
warning.
question is whether discussion should be rigorous. It's whether balance is being used to deepen understanding or to avoid taking a position in the face of harm. Because when violence is this visible, neutrality and even calls for balance can begin to look like complicity. And thirdly, from reaction to prevention, attempts to intervene before harm occurs. And this brings us back, it brings us to a broader question. If what we witness in Gaza and now in Iran and Lebanon is the normalization of civilian harm under the language of security and strategy, then what role will civil society play in interrupting that? Can this level of mobilization extend to other crises? What conditions make it or made it possible here? If the past few years have shown us anything, it's that protection will not be guaranteed, but they have also shown us something else, that people are refusing to accept that. So in the absence of protection, people have become its carriers. And in refusing silence, they're beginning to redraw what protection can mean. And just before I wrap up, I do want to go back to what Amra was saying, asking about hope, whether we're feeling of hope. And I always quote a wonderful comrade of mine who once said that he was asked what the opposite of despair was. And when he said, and his answer wasn't hope, it was action. So that's what we need to keep remembering. What is our action? Accountability, pressure, courage, advocacy, activism, whatever you can do, that's your action. So thank you very much. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dalia. I think you're leaving us with very thoughtful issues around solidarity. What does solidarity mean versus neutrality versus accountability versus complicity? I think this is something which is going to be discussed more and more. And this linking with civil society in engaging with protecting civilians in many, many crises apart from this region. You did talk about community-based protection, and we will have Yiping focus on that. That is another area which has really grown in the last decade. There has been a lot of engagement and agency support to affected populations. Hopefully the same kind of engagement will occur with conversations on civil society vis-a-vis protection of civilians. Thank you very much again. And over to you, Yiping. Again, hopefully some silver linings. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me be a part of this important conversation. I'm calling in from the unceded, unsurrendered traditional territory of the Algonquin Shinabeg. And to kind of explore this like prompt or focus on the critical role played by healthcare workers and the wider Palestinian community in spotlighting the harm. I thought about referring to a paper that a group of us published in the Health and Human Rights Journal in December of last year, titled People-Centered Accountability Amid the Gaza Genocide. And it explores a few different case studies, including Doctors Against Genocide, Healthcare Workers Watch, and the Freedom Flotilla Coalition. I thought it'd be a good kind of piece to reference given the academic paper nature of this work, but also of this kind of conversation situated in an academic institution at this time. So we situate these actors, being Doctors Against Genocide, Health Care Workers Watch, and the Freedom Flotilla Coalitions. These actors work within international human rights law, social accountability scholarship, and decolonial and abolitionist critiques. We show how these actors are able to combine clinical documentation, survivor testimony, and direct action to monitor human rights violations, generate medically literate records of the harm inflicted and press for remedies that are state-centered mechanisms where those have failed to deliver despite findings of war crimes and genocide by United Nations bodies and human rights groups. Across these cases, we identify some common practices and tensions surrounding coalition building, risks to documentation, navigating a media environment of mis or disinformation, and engaging strategically with institutions that often reproduce health harms or are directly complicit. We argue that these movements treat people-centered accountability as part of their professional duty and act as on a mandate to prevent mass atrocity crimes rather than being silent. And we conclude by outlining some practical implications for clinicians, professional associations, and health systems seeking to align their global health practice with a people-centered approach to accountability. Accountability is foundational in law, human rights, bioethics, and public health. It includes criminal prosecution, civil lawsuits, and non-judicial arrangements such as Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and National Human Rights Commissions. Human rights accountability encompasses state-level accountability and people-centered accountability. Accountability to affected populations is a subset of people-centered accountability. While in health, a state-level accountability requires states and armed actors to uphold legal obligations and ensure minimum essential services, such as those outlined in the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other instruments. People-centered accountability centers affected persons through access to information, safely providing feedback and exposing human rights violations, and active participation in designing, monitoring, and adapting aid and other programs to meet people's evolving needs and remedies. It aims to make aid relevant, appropriate, and effective, and to shift power dynamics from one-way aid provision to bidirectional community partnerships. People-centered accountability is less dependent on state action and thus less easily immobilized by such sanctions. For example, UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese continues her work while the International Criminal Court's work has been delayed. People-centered accountability resists the premise that large institutions are the only path to justice. It is guided by communities in need of redress. They determine the terms of accountability and what it entails for the harms that they have endured. Abolitionist traditions critique institutions built on oppression as structurally incapable of centering justice. From this perspective, the state-level accountability's ineffectiveness arises from inadequate design. Poet and activist Audre Lorde famously wrote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." The United Nations has been criticized for enabling the 1948 Nakba, the Zionist paramilitary-led ethnic cleansing of Palestine and violent displacement of Palestinians. People-centered accountability holds that accountability for genocide cannot be dictated by those enabling it or distant from affected communities. Against this backdrop, Doctors Against Genocide, Healthcare Workers Watch, and the Freedom Flotilla Coalition represent coalitions of healthcare workers, civil society, and parliamentarians who refuse the role of passive witness. Their praxis exemplify human rights globalization, translocal networks translating global norms into localized insurgent institutional practices, thereby expanding who enforces human rights and how. These groups, Doctors Against Genocide, Healthcare Workers Watch, and the Freedom Flotillas, all deploy documentation practices designed to meet evidentiary thresholds familiar to international court standards and UN mechanisms, yet none of them treat jurisdictional success as the endpoint of accountability. The literature on social accountability is instructive. Citizen-led oversight can produce gains when it combines pressure from below with tactical openings from above, but such gains depend on the responsiveness of the target institutions and the ability of civic actors to sustain independent power. Doctors Against Genocide's decision to pair UN submissions with clinician-facing actions and direct pressure on professional bodies, and Healthcare Workers Watch's insistence on clinically literate narratives that make the health system's consequences legible beyond the courtroom reflect on understanding that prevention requires forms of authority that do not rely on state sanction. Accountability initiatives can be effective when they build on independent community power and elicit timely responses from authorities, rather than relying on retrospective review alone. For effective people-centered accountability, coalitions must invest in trauma-informed, security-aware practices for clinicians and witnesses. The evidence on mental health burdens amongst health workers in conflict shows sustained elevations in anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. Programs that blend peer support, protected time away from exposure, confidential counseling, and fair remuneration are not luxuries. They are preconditions for ethical documentation and for continuity of care. When the formal system withholds remedy, social movements have turned to public hearings, such as those often seen in the student encampments, juries convened by civil society, and even people's tribunals to gather testimony, apply international standards, and issue findings that create a durable public record. These do not replace courts, and they should not be designed to avoid replicating judicial exclusions. Their value lies in legitimizing survivor knowledge, truth-telling, setting out standards of conduct for professions and institutions, and generating moral and political pressure that accumulates over time. People-centered accountability, as articulated by Palestinian clinicians and allies, aligns with decolonizing critiques in global health. The aim is to not replace one authority with another, but to reorder who can speak about, verify, and decide what counts as harm and repair. Social movements are part of the care ecology, with their own epistemologies, ethics, and practices of remembrance. For clinicians, allyship demands refusing to normalize the dismantling of care, the routinization of death in custody and disappearance, and the separation of duty from advocacy when separation costs lives. Debates on decolonization often call for shifts in authorship, agenda setting, and resource control. Gaza calls for restoring material conditions for health and centering Palestinian clinical authority as prerequisites for the right to health. These ideals are not rhetorical. They are clinical, jurisdictional, human rights, and ethical propositions tested in one of today's hardest cases. Gaza is both a site of suffering and one of methodological advance. Clinicians and communities have shown that credible, clinically grounded evidence can be produced under siege. Coalitions can bridge professions and identities, and remedies can matter at the bedside. Still unfinished is the building effective institutional protective arrangements, sustaining inside-outside accountabilities that resist co-optation, and reorienting professional authority toward prevention rather than post hoc lament. If state-centered systems remain unable or unwilling to deliver, accountability from below will proceed, counting the dead with accuracy, confirming human rights violations and violators, preserving the names and methods of those who cared, and insisting that the right to health is a claim on power exercisable by the people themselves. You can read the full article. I can share it in the chat. I share like many excerpts as I just did from this article because there are countless examples of this kind of people-centered accountability during this Gaza genocide. And I think some of these groups, like Doctors Against Genocide, Healthcare Workers Watch, and the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, continue to do what they do because they are unapologetic about the ways in which ultimately people are the ones that will take care of people when states fail. And it's an honor to share this work and be a conduit for this work, and ultimately just I think turn to the work that they're doing. Doctors Against Genocide hosts a weekly webinar on Sunday afternoons. Eastern time at noon, and you can hear directly from our colleagues who are working in hospitals, in the emergency rooms, in the clinics, in places like Gaza, in places like Sudan and Congo, where genocide continues to unfold. Or you can look towards Healthcare Workers Watch for the target targeted destruction and killing and detention of Palestinian healthcare workers by the Israeli occupation and the ways in which that crime has been documented. Or towards the Freedom Flotilla Coalition and their longstanding efforts to break the illegal siege and blockade by the Israeli occupation on the Gaza Strip, dating back to 2007, and their efforts have begun under the Free Gaza movement since 2008. And the largest maritime direct action challenge to Israel's illegal siege and blockade on the Gaza Strip will take place in the coming weeks.
1 minute warning.
Massive mobilization across European ports to attempt to once again challenge the illegal blockade and siege on the Gaza Strip. So there are many opportunities for hope, and as mentioned by others, it is only through action, and action is the ultimate antidote to despair in these moments of terrible, I think, global unrest and tragedy, but created by an economy of war, militarism, and genocide, and that reshifting towards an economy of care and well-being and of health and humanity is one that we all have a role in playing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yiping, for keeping in time. I think you make quite a few significant points. I do hope people-centered accountability becomes a catchphrase and is applied with the suggestions that you and Doctors Against Genocide are making. I also want to point out that what you're talking about, communities documenting their own harm, we're also seeing now with the current conflict in Iran. Iran's also had an internet blackout. So again, it's finally communities protecting themselves, documenting accurately, and this being taken up with institutions. And as you note, the more you speak up, the more pressure there can be on the duty bearers. So thank you very much for that. And now we will turn over to do a tour de table with all the panelists coming in. If there is anything you would like to add to your presentation, so if you could all have your videos on, all the panelists. We seem to have lost Jane. Hopefully she will come back on. She seems to have an internet problem going on. So if we could have each one of the panelists sort of put up your hand if you'd like to either add to your presentation or you'd like to respond to anything that any of the other panelists have presented. Over to you. If you put up your hand, I can ask you to speak. Heidi, I don't know if you want to complete any point as you were cut off by us. Sorry about that. Would you like to conclude with anything? Perhaps begin with you, and while the others bring their thoughts together, I'm glad to see Jane's back on. Heidi, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So I think just from the perspective of articulating some policy options moving forward, and I think these will address some of the questions that have been circulating in the Q&A box as well. I mean, there's a range of stuff. I'm not sure I would couch this in the language of hope, but much more, as Delia suggested, in the language of like concrete action, right? So articulating like a discernible plan of political action that is inflected by all sorts of other considerations. From my perspective, most directly considerations relating to human rights and international law. Specifically today, I'm talking about international humanitarian law. So with respect to the question of third states, and what I mean here is basically any state that's not an actual party to any of the conflicts we've been discussing, They all have very serious obligations when it comes to systematic IHL violations, as well as genocide itself, right? And the failure of these states to act is in part due to the failure of their populations to demand that they actually act, right? We've heard already from several of the other panelists about various modalities of direct action and political pressure, all of which are incredibly important that we can engage in. But accountability essentially starts at home, right? With getting our own states to actually do something. Because that lack of doing something on the part of states, we'll talk about Canada for our purposes here today, or for mine anyway, the failure to take meaningful action, I think, particularly in the face of the serious risk of genocide in Gaza, which has already been determined to exist by the International Court of Justice as early as January 2024, so nearly 2.5 years. I mean, an incredible amount of time, right? That's a judicial determination that has been made. The failure to take meaningful action in the face of that determination creates the vulnerability and sustains the vulnerability around protection of civilians, questions that we've addressed, and is having spillover effects in Iran, Lebanon, and elsewhere in the region, but also in the world, as has been mentioned. And so we see that even yesterday, right, when Prime Minister Carney was asked to comment on Trump's statement, his genocidal statement, and the most that Carney could come up with in the moment was to say that all parties to the conflict must abide by international law, right? And so one wonders whether this is like the common refrain. All parties must abide by international law, without mentioning, of course, Canada's strong moral support for the initial attacks at the end of February on Iran, which, as we know, are manifestly unlawful in the sense that there was no claim to self-defense cognizable within Article 51 of the UN Charter, and no authorization by the Security Council, right? So the war itself is unlawful, in addition to the strong evidence that we have of violations conducted in the course of the war. Early on, of course, we saw the attack on the girls' school in Minab in Iran. There's very serious reason to believe that may have been a war crime. It may have involved reckless use of artificial intelligence, or any number of elements of a mistake that actually carry the requisite mental element to establish a war crime. So just really quickly, things that can be done, right, to respond to the Gaza playbook and the ramifications that have been mentioned, in particular with respect to the present situation in Iran, because that's kind of at front of mind this morning, would involve demanding clear denunciations from each of our governments, whether that's Canada or Australia or the UK or others, right? Clear denunciation of the illegality of the war itself, right? So retraction by Carney, full retraction of initial support for the war. Denunciation and calls for accountability for suspected war crimes, including strong support for international judicial institutions, including the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. The ending of any form of material assistance for these unlawful acts that will look different depending on the jurisdiction you're in, but would include forbidding the use of sovereign airspace, for military operations, the use of bases, any kind of military cooperation or sharing of personnel, demanding a permanent ceasefire, right? It's not accepting a kind of very fragile, unclear 2-week ceasefire type thing, demanding a permanent end to the war, and ending any kind of trade rather in military components or weaponry, again, depending on the jurisdiction, with the United States and Israel. There's obviously a host of other really concrete policy demands that can be made, but these are steps that are prerequisites really for addressing these questions around the protection of civilians that every citizen can engage in demanding in one way or another in their home constituencies. Thanks.
Thanks, Heidi. Any of the other panelists, have you got anything? You do see questions coming in as well. So I don't know if we should just, all right, Amra, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you, Dahlia. I agree. I found hope through action as well. I was very frustrated, and then I started to do things. I wrote and I spoke to people, and I found that shifted, and I felt like I could felt like I could feel like I was doing something constructive. In terms of people listening, I mean, I think talking to people about what's happening, I still find that we assume that a lot of people know what's happening, and I think people are in information bubbles and they don't really. A lot of people who should know don't know because of the poor reporting and coverage in mainstream media, and also in bias sort of normal, and people are funneled into different social media bubbles as well. Oh, and also writing letters to local members. My friends do that quite a lot. Just, it helps. It really does help. It does signal that people care and they want to see their members represent their interests. Just in terms of this, I've seen in the chat this thing between UN and member states. I added a comment basically saying the UN Security Council is member states, the General Assembly is member states. It is really incumbent on member states to step up and to help the UN. I find it really frustrating because I think the UN is under so much pressure. It's under intense political attacks. It's under intense physical attacks. We've had record humanitarian aid worker death tolls. The attacks on UNRWA, I've never seen anything like this before. And I think we need to really be clear-eyed and not naive about what's driving this. People want to remove the current order and replace it with something that serves more illiberal agendas. The UN is checks and balances. So while we should critique it and want something better, I think we need to understand that this might makes right world wants to remove it and have no rules or institutions that can constrain them. So we can critique it, but understand it has played a really important role in maintaining international peace and security and protecting civilians, as imperfect as it's been. I will also add something that's slightly contradictory and say that, in crisis is opportunity. So I think the UN didn't really get us as far as we should have gone on many issues, and there's been a lot of injustice and double standards, which have been extreme in Gaza, but are not unique to Gaza. And I think, we should also hope for to try and forge something better out of this really difficult moment. So thanks.
Thank you, Amra. Over to Jane.
Thank you. And I think I have some points that would echo Amra's really, but to me, there is a good question in the chat about whether the whole international system needs a revamp. And I think many people feel this, that the system that we're in is coming under strain, and some of that is structural, some of it is coming from a more multipolar world, although at least the UN Security Council, for all its flaws, it does bring the US to sit regularly with China and Russia, which probably is something quite important for the contemporary world, if only they couldn't block everything in the way that they do. The problem is that there are competing visions of what international order should come next. And most people and most countries in the world do not have an interest in that being a might is right world, because that will be dominated by a very small number of leaders who are all in different ways increasingly unconstrained by domestic constitutions and domestic public opinion. So I think the important thing before defending any specific institution is standing up for the principles about having a world where there is a respect for a basic dignity of all human beings, no matter where they are born or what state they live in, and trying to have that international system that does work for as many people as possible and isn't defined only in the interests of a few. And I think that at the moment, a lot of the debates that we're coming across about international law, they come down to these real moral fundamentals. We're not in an era where the priorities are debating niceties of international law or exact structures of institutions. We are in an era where the world's richest man, Elon Musk, will openly say that the West's problem is an excess of empathy. And we need a very broad movement, and I believe most people are on this side, a very broad movement that says, no, we need a world with more empathy, more understanding, and a commitment to protecting one another. At the end of the day, our whole planet is facing risks that we all share. Let's not be bombing each other's food and hospitals when we need to work together to protect the continuation of human life on the planet altogether.
Thank you very much, Jade. I think we've moved pretty much into the Q&A, so perhaps I'll just invite all the panelists to respond. I see some of the panelists. Thank you very much, Jane. I don't know who else has already started responding to some of the questions that have come in. I'm happy to pick questions if that's all right with you, or would you just like to pick it yourselves as you all seem to be reading it? What do you think? All right, I will pick a question then. So there is one question which is to Heidi. Could you specifically talk about the efficacy of citizen-led aid convoy or boat movements?
I think Dahlia had her hand up a moment ago.
Oh, I'm
So I'll let Dahlia go ahead first.
Now, you
Yeah.
know, I have glasses and I still don't spot people. The screen's sort of moving around, but yes, go ahead, Dahlia.
I was gonna pick one of the questions and go with it. So I'm happy to do that after Heidi or before. It's okay either way.
All right, Dahlia, please go, and then Heidi.
One of the questions in the Q&A section is how would local civilians be on board to talk about genocide if they can lose their jobs or get expelled from universities for doing so? And we get this a lot. I get this a lot as a question is I can't do anything. I might lose my job. My answer is always find your lane, find the area that you can do. Not everyone has the same risk acceptance or aversion, and that's okay. Nobody will benefit if people who are empathetic and caring and want to see positive change lose their jobs and have to stress about paying their bills and feeding their children. That's not the goal here. The actual goal of the movement is to continue to sustain it. And I would say, again, going back to the different areas, over the past few years, we've seen all kind of niche solidarity movements come up for Palestine and Gaza, like artists, music, food, whatever you can do. And like Amra said, writing letters to your MPs, meeting them, meeting your elected officials, pressuring, talking to your family about it, whatever is your comfort zone, do it. Find your people, find your niche, for lack of a better word, and that's okay if there is that risk aversion because the pushback is strong, it's high, and it's intense and relentless. There are systemic ways to dox people now, and there is a whole mechanism and machine at work to do so, and not everyone has the same level of risk, like I said. So find the area that you can do, that you can contribute within, and try to grow from there. Try to help from there. Even pushing back on language. If someone uses conflict, just correct them and say it's a genocide. If someone uses, oh, like 40 people dead in Iran, no, it's 40 people killed. By whom? Name the perpetrator, name the that. So these small shifts, it's like a death by 1,000 cuts. We eventually momentum will pick up and keep going. So that would be my answer to that in general, but happy to hear from the rest of my colleagues as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Dahlia. Heidi, do you want to come in, or I have another question which is for all the panelists because I see you're already typing for this question. Would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, and Yiping might have something to say here as well. Yeah, I mean, look, and I took part in an independent vessel that sailed alongside the Global Sumud Flotilla in September of 2025. So I have some personal experience in Tunisia specifically as part of that movement. I was also on the ground when several of the vessels were attacked by incendiary devices while they were in port in Tunis. And I work with the flotilla movement, the Canada Book to Gaza as well. So Yeah, I mean, this is actually something that there's like a bit of debate within the flotilla movement, which has grown like drastically over the last year and a half, about the effectiveness, including in the current kind of geopolitical context, the effectiveness of moving forward with large flotillas, but also like kind of general safety concerns, and comparisons with other sorts of direct action that might be available, including dock workers across Europe and other places. So there's a lot of really important, I think, discussion going on around exactly this question at the moment. I don't pretend to have any answers to any of that, but just to signal that that's an important and ongoing conversation. Um, I'll speak a bit from the perspective of international criminal law, which is to say that uh, one of the earliest flotillas that launched in 2010 involved a deadly attack by IDF forces during its interception, and during the abduction of the volunteers. 10 people, Turkish citizens, were killed on board a vessel called the Mavi Marmara, and that actually led to over 10 years of protracted litigation at the International Criminal Court itself, which, although ultimately did not result in a successful prosecution, um, led to a lot of discussion within the international criminal law community, and also offered an avenue, an early avenue, for uh, Palestinian freedom or emancipation movement to have a kind of a space at the ICC long before the state of Palestine actually became a state party to the court, right? So at a very early moment, an earlier moment in the court's history and an earlier moment in interaction with the court. And so that I think was really productive, actually. And so much has changed now on the legal plane in terms of the ICC. Specifically, there's an open investigation. I mentioned the arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, that I think there's actually quite fertile terrain for further movement with respect to crimes committed as part of IDF interceptions and attacks on more recent flotilla movements. So due to time, I'll just leave it there.
There are quite a few questions here on how do we address the impunity, the ongoing impunity. How do we get political action? How do we get our voices heard? Different questions, but I'm paraphrasing this. So over to you on this. I know you've all given a few solutions through your presentations, but perhaps an elaboration on this. The questions also have a bit of skepticism about, is the UN still fit for purpose? So over to you all on these. Jane.
Thanks. I mean, I want to come back on the UN and then also on what people can do. Because I think that it's very true that it is the states that are the problem within the UN system. But that is also meaning, that senior officials in the UN are more cautious than they might otherwise be, especially when, they still depend on the US for a lot of UN funding. The US has cut its funding, but it hasn't cancelled all of its funding. So it's retaining that leverage of trying to push and trying to shape the UN. The US will also be putting forward candidates for quite a number of senior UN positions, including at the World Food Programme and the Deputy High Commissioner on Refugees, both positions that will have a lot to do with civilian protection. So I do think there needs to be a great deal of mobilisation to encourage the UN and your governments in Canada, the UK, or wherever, to stand up for a stronger UN. One of the things that's happening right now is a selection process for the next Secretary General. And it really does need to be a candidate that will be willing to stand up for human rights and international law. There's a good question here from Lindsay in Ghana talking about the role of Kofi Annan, who went to Rwanda and said, we have to acknowledge that the UN failed the people of Rwanda. And Lindsay asked whether Secretary General Guterres should say the same thing about Gaza. Now, many UN staff feel that Guterres has done too little, and in fact, there is an organisation of staff within the UN called UN Staff for Gaza, which has had the blessing of former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, among others, who are calling on the UN to do more at a senior level, to stand up, to call it a genocide, to call more for accountability. And maybe there will be opportunities as Guterres gets closer to the end of this term. In terms of his personality, he does shy away from political controversy and he has focused a lot more on humanitarianism and on climate. But maybe there is an opportunity for him to make a big statement as he's on the way out and as he may then feel that the UN is less likely to be punished by the US for things that he says. It's also worth looking at the role of the special rapporteurs and the special envoys. So Anthony, who I know here from UNA UK, is asking about naming and shaming those who choose war and those who violate international law. Every year, there is the UN Secretary General's report on children in armed conflict. There is a special envoy, Vanessa Frazier, an amazing Maltese diplomat whose focus is on children in armed conflict. And that report works by naming and shaming countries that do abuse children in armed conflict in a variety of ways, whether that's recruiting child soldiers, killing and maiming children, or denying humanitarian aid and food to children. That report, I believe it comes out in May. It needs attention, it needs media coverage, it needs people to react, because if people react to those reports, countries try to get off the list. And interestingly, some countries have. Iraq and the Philippines have both worked with the UN to reduce the violations of children's rights in armed conflicts in their own countries, partly because they wanted the validation of being taken off the list of shame. So that is one positive example. We might also look at the special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese. I'm sure many of you know her work, and she has cut through to a whole different audience of people who don't normally hear what the UN has to say. She is under a lot of political pressure, including US financial sanctions, and supporting people like that. You know, our own government in the UK has criticised her, and I think it's very important that we say, hands off the UN Special Rapporteurs. You may not like what they say, but let them speak because that is their job, and they're not there to please governments. They are there to hold governments to account. Public support definitely does help. So writing to your MP, that is a good thing to do. Consumer boycotts are also useful. Here in the UK, there's a supermarket chain called the Co-op, which has declined to stock products from 12 countries because they are on UN human rights blacklists. And to me, that's a really interesting way of how the private sector can put some of the UN findings into account, even when governments aren't doing what they should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to this, or I could ask you another question. Amra.
Thank you. I'm just going to respond to the Security Council question in the chat, because initially my research started to focus on the Security Council, and then I spent time in New York and I observed it. And there's no shortage of reform measures. There's been plenty of attempts to reform the Security Council. There's still many ongoing. It requires the permanent five members to agree, and of course that would require them giving up some power. So I think in this current geopolitical environment that is highly unlikely to happen. But what we have seen is the General Assembly no veto initiative, which is triggered when from a veto from the Council, which then pushes it down to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly, which is more representative and can add more moral weight to an issue, and it has been quite useful in the Gaza in terms of getting opinions from the ICJ. So just a bit of technical issues around that. I don't think it's as simple as replacing the council, or I think, as Jane mentioned, it is still a use, even if we're not happy with the outcomes, and it's certainly not sufficient at the moment. At least as a diplomatic measure, it is a pressure valve system that can release some pressure. When there's no mechanism, I think the risks of miscalculation and escalation is a far more dangerous world. And just, I really want to reinforce this point around the UN that yes, reform is necessary. Everyone agrees on that, or most people agree on that. But we are facing a situation where people are trying to pull it apart deliberately to replace it with something worse. So I think so when I went from focusing on the council to really looking at the geopolitical dynamics and this shift towards might makes right, where people are trying to pull apart these orders, the order and the rules and the norms and the institutions, so they don't have anything to constrain their behavior. So again, I just want to give a little bit of room to recognize and respect the UN for what it is doing in really difficult circumstances, while also acknowledging it needs to be reformed and that we should be working towards something better. But I don't think, for example, what's the alternative right now, which is being pushed, is the board of peace, which is certainly not. It's a far worse outcome. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to add on this, or I can just share a final question before we close? Okay, this is an interesting one. I think this is something Heidi and I have certainly had discussions around. Where and to what extent does the morality deficit come into the discussion? So we're talking about laws, we're talking about norms, we're talking about institutions. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this concept of a morality deficit. Jane.
I think that we are experiencing a crisis of values here, and that it's good to discuss it in those terms, and that's why we need to have a discussion about empathy, and we need to have a discussion about how we treat other humans. And, I really believe in international law. I think international law is an accumulation of a great deal of wisdom. But I also fear that when we talk about international law, it can sound quite abstract. And also because we call it law, and we're all used to something called law in our domestic countries, it creates the impression of it being something that will be implemented by somebody else. And in a way, it is also about our own values and having a certain moral compass, but being able to say this has to apply to everybody. I think we saw, just in the last 24 hours with some of the response to Trump's threats, both what the Pope said and in a video that I saw by Senator Chris Murphy, I found very compelling because he said that before we even get to international law, we have to talk about what's right and wrong, and this is clearly wrong. And I think regardless of culture, most people can see that. And so I think that traditionally many analysts and experts and lawyers have been weary of speaking in what seem like emotional or subjective terms about values and principles. But given where we are and what's being debated now and what is at stake, I think we do need to discuss it in those terms. We have to be careful as well because nobody likes being moralized at, and willing to be morally perfect. So we need to be careful about patronizing people. But I do think appealing to people's hearts and the empathy that they do have in there is critical to how we communicate about all of these issues in the future.
Thank you, Jane. Yiping.
Yeah, I think I think I agree with this idea that uh like there are double standards of how we look at who is considered human and who our values and principles like apply to. And this has kind of changed over time, but I think like um and because I had to look this up, like morality deficit, and like with applying it, I think at an individual level, um, you kind of like um, don't actually look at the broader issue of the structures and the systems that actually created the system of like settler colonial violence, for example. And I think that's that's where my mind goes to, where the system is actually producing the outcomes perfectly for what it's been designed to do. If we look at how settler colonialism in North America has produced the outcomes that it has, and also Zionist settler colonialism in the context of occupied Palestine at the hands of Israel. And so in some ways it's just very clear that the people are seeing things for what they truly are and what they have always been. And we're seeing people get away with more and more. Um, but it hasn't always been this way, right? Just like looking at historical and ongoing genocides, like the genocidal rhetoric is as others have pointed out, from the president down south has just openly calling for genocide, and these kinds of rhetoric has just been so pervasive over these past few years, where it's at a level where people can get away with it, and I think that also reflects how, at an individual level, there's a great sense of at times a great sense of apathy and hopelessness. And I do think I want to remind us all, and I have to remind myself almost on a daily basis, that that is what the people who are in powerful positions of wealth and powerful positions of political power, that is what they want us to believe and think. To be hopeless and to be apathetic and to feel like we can't change these systems. But these systems have changed over time. Apartheid has fell in history. Um, uh, Emancipation has happened for people who were previously enslaved, right? There are massive wins for civil rights, for liberation and revolution movements, and it's only because of mass organizing and people power to force the hands of the rich and powerful to change their ways. And so I do think, some of the questions that I'm seeing is kind of reflective of like, oh, like how will things ever change? But it's only because of everyone's contribution do things change, and we just have to kind of pick one or two areas that we can be most effective, or feel we're surrounded by good people doing good work and pushing towards that common horizon of liberation, of collective liberation, including for Palestinians. Do we get closer to that? And I think my last thought is that, spending time with indigenous communities in the context of Turtle Island, and also Palestinian communities in the context of occupied Palestine, many people organize knowing that sometimes the things that we're organizing towards, like liberation, might not be within our lifetimes. And it doesn't mean we don't do that work. We still do it, knowing that it might not be successful, but there's no alternative. Like we are, it is intergenerational work to move towards that common horizon of collective liberation for a better world for everyone, and to do that also means we're doing it for multiple generations down the line, for a livable planet, for a livable society, for one where there are equal and basic human rights for every person. Is I think that common struggle that will bring us all together towards that. Um, towards building something that is alternative to what we're seeing, that I think causes so much moral injury and distress by just kind of consuming it. And I think that is where doing something tangible on a day-to-day basis, a practice of being a part of a broader social political movement for liberation, is also what is can be healing to the moral injury that we're all experiencing, and to know that we're not alone in experiencing that.
Thank you very much, Yiping. I think we're almost running out of time. There is a last interesting question, and I'm going to paraphrase this again. It is about the changing nature of state responsibility. And my question to all of you is state responsibility still the most paramount? Because that is what we always learn in international law. So if anyone has any thoughts on that. Heidi, I was hoping, oh, Amra, please.
Maybe Heidi can come in after me. My answer will be brief. I think it's multi-tiered. I think we've spoken about individual people power, like whether it through multi-layers of actions, it's civil society, it is states. It's always going to be multi-tiered, and also to understand that states also shift, or depending on the state model, but states shift with domestic pressure. So that's writing letters to members. It's preserving human rights around freedom of expression, academic freedom, right to peaceful protest, things like this. This is all connected. Domestic political pressure plays a really important role in moving states and shifting positions on crisis issues. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I don't know that I have much to add to that other than to say, yeah, I mean, all levers of power are crucial, right? I mean, if we're talking about state responsibility within the traditional international legal framework, we do know, right? This has come up in some of the questions as well, how long it takes to get, a ruling at the ICJ, for example, and then how limited those rulings and disappointing those rulings can be. They lacked effectiveness and some senses around enforceability, et cetera, right? So, non-state actors and corporate accountability also super important. A few of the panelists have alluded to that, but really every lever of power, and that in terms of organizing and thinking politically, whether you're a lawyer or civil servant or whatever role you're playing in the world, one needs to think concretely about where those levers of power are, who should press where and why, right? So there's no, most important factor here by any stretch.
Thank you. If nobody else has anything to add, I mean, I think we're reaching the end of. Oh, Jane, please.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on the kind of private sector point, especially because I think that businesses have been accustomed to an environment where large parts of the world have been relatively peaceful and predictable. And if we're seeing an ongoing increase of conflicts and erosion of international law, that is going to mean a worse environment for businesses. And I think we've seen the initial signs of that with the increased costs on shipping, first around Yemen and the Red Sea, and then recently around the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, there will be private sector investors who are profiting from all these things, but I think when we think more widely about businesses that want a predictable, safe environment to operate in, they have a stake in this peaceful world. And you could argue that they've been free riding on governments, that governments have provided a relatively secure environment that is now slipping away. So I hope there could be more work done with businesses, such as those that have got involved in supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, which does include a goal on peace and security, to say, for us all to continue functioning and having a global economy that grows, we need peace and we need international law. So that's something I'd love to put out there, and something I hope that you can share if you're with a business or you have friends in the private sector, to get people thinking more about that shared responsibility for protecting the world together.
Excellent. I think that rounds it off. We are definitely at the end now, so let me just conclude and thank you all. And thank you to the audience for joining and your concern for protection of civilians. We will have a recording of this up on the Dudley Institute website, as well as the Refugee Studies Center at York University. We will also share it with those who've registered. There is a shorter report, not the entire discussion of the panel, which will be produced from this panel, which is geared towards policymakers. That'll also be public again. So thank you very much again, and good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Okay, bye.